Hey there, Mama. Welcome back to the Working Mama podcast. I hope you're having a good week so far. This week on this podcast, I speak with Renee Barnes, who is the founder and also director of The People Paradox. And this week we're talking about the notion of the Superwoman. I have to say, I didn't really know, I knew a little bit about this before our chat, but when I was doing some research around this podcast, I actually really opened my eyes around the topic. And also we go in and around as well talking about the skills that we gain as a mum and while we're on maternity leave and how we can actually use these to our advantage. Because as we all know, being on maternity leave is no holiday. It's probably the toughest gig you will ever have. So I'll let you get into it. Just as a quick note, Renee and I were often told to each other and recommended that you should, collaborate and get in touch, even recently on a One Roof chat about podcast guests that I was putting a call out for. So we're both really, really passionate about supporting working mums, particularly in this space. And I'm sure that passion you will see come through. So as always as well, if you could leave a rating or review, or even just let someone else know as well about this podcast, if it's a friend or a work colleague that is navigating the juggle of working mum life, please, if you could recommend it, that would be amazing. So I'll let you get into today's chat with Renee. Welcome to the Working Mama podcast, a show that provides real-world tips, tricks, and advice to all working mamas on how they can have a career, family, and hopefully one day break the glass ceiling. Welcome, Renee, to the Working Mama podcast. It's so good to finally have you on here. How's your day going so far?
It's going so well. Thank you so much for the invitation on. I can't wait.
My pleasure. It's funny because so many people often say, do you know Renee? Or I know people say to you, do you know Karina? And we're like, yes, we do talk. Why is this? Because we're both so passionate about topics such as matrescence, supporting women about return to work, and also female leaders in the workplace. I've had the opportunity to chat to you offline and many times, and I absolutely love it. So I'm really looking forward to today's chat. But for those of you or people that don't know you, how would you best describe yourself?
This is actually always a hard question. It's like, do I go with those big identity buckets? Where do I start here?
Everyone always says that.
Yeah, it should be simple. So I think where I'd probably actually start is I'll come to the identity buckets, but I think what really describes me as a person is just somebody who is deeply empathetic, very creative, and I really value freedom and integrity. And I think then if we look at who I am, I'm a mum to two boys. So I have Hamish, who is 6, and I have Max, who is 4. And I've been working in people and culture for over 20 years. I'm the director of The People Paradox, which is a business I founded 7 years ago. And I support small to medium-sized business developing their people infrastructure and then programs that really set up those businesses for growth. And I guess part of the reason why we're talking is I have seen countless mothers return to work and really struggle with what the workplace and society is asking of them, but also what they expect of themselves during this period of rapid growth and change, which we know as matrescence. And this is the Superwoman character that I know that we're going to get to as part of today's episode.
Yeah, it's certainly a notion there. And I have to say, I actually didn't really know too much about what a superwoman is, but I've since actually done some research and I'm like, wow, this needs to be out there a little bit more similar to what matrescence is. So let's just kick it off. What is the notion of a superwoman?
Do you want to go there first?
Let's go there. Let's just put it all out on the table.
Okay. Well, recently I was invited to speak to a group of senior women in business on this topic, and that was on behalf of the Swiss Chamber of Commerce and Swiss Wellness. And that keynote really focused on cancelling Superwoman. But the opportunity was born out of an interesting conversation with the event hosts, where they really lent in when I said to them, mothers returning to work is not just about the mental load. So the Superwoman reference is reflective of women shouldering expectations and responsibilities that are truly unrealistic and more often than not achievable, and therefore, requires superhuman ability in order to achieve all of the things that's being demanded. And it really works in alignment with the perfect mother myth and that pedestal that we've created for the ideal mother over time, which is so detached from reality. And I think in my research and in my own experience and opinion, it really reduces motherhood in a lot of ways. You know, I've done a lot of work on my values. I support a lot of other mothers to clarify who they are and what their values are, because it gives you permission to be authentically you in motherhood and accepting of what you're not. So, for example, perfect mother myth that was born centuries ago, you know, refers to being nurturing, kind and gentle and compliant, and perhaps in more modern times being completely selfless, giving to others. And whilst I like to think that I'm nurturing and kind, I really strive to be inspiring. I'm really quite playful, and I want to teach my boys resilience and adventure. So if I'm behaving in a way that's not true to me, I'll be showing up, you know, in a way that's not authentic to my children. And I think that we need to shape our little humans to be different from those gender norms from centuries ago. So that traditional notion of motherhood isn't overly relevant, and yet it persists in all of our stories, our minds, our expectations. And it's those expectations partnered with who we are authentically, partnered with the workplace expectations and that ideal worker, which I know we'll come to as well, with gender norms, that suddenly creates this need for mothers to be superhuman. And I'll just finish that point with saying this is all happening at a time when so many women are sleep deprived. They're transitioning into motherhood, and there's a new identity that's really being shaped. So they're naturally looking for validation on how to do this right. Similar to what happens in adolescence, you know, we look to our role models, we look to the people around us. They're really vulnerable. And we need more support structures and education so they don't conform to that old myth, and they don't stay silent in the shadow of Superwoman.
Well said. And there's certainly a lot into that. And as I said, I love the notion of returning to work is not just about them sharing the mental load, because there's also so many elements of it, which I know we could spend a whole podcast and probably multiple podcasts dissecting. But it's also really, it really does probably put into not everyone likes labels, but also that notion about the pedestal and shouldering the load, or, you know, where did this good mother notion, like this amazing mother notion, come from? Because why isn't good enough okay? Like and even some days accepting I'm going to be a crap mum, and that's okay as well. Like there's this, I don't know if it's the rise of social media, but where does it come? What are the influences? Because I don't know if my mum talked about it when she was, you know, a similar stage, but it seems to be definitely over the last, 10, 20 years, this has definitely come more into a focus. Oh, I've got to be this right mum, and what it is and the expectations, and it's also, I guess, really, it's not since probably the 1970s when it was starting to take off of more women in the workplace as well. And then navigating, well, I still want to be able to work, and then I still want a career. And I guess, as you're saying, those hundreds of years of what a good woman really is, of you're needing to have babies and raise the family, and that's your role in life. And obviously, over the last 50 years, women are really challenging that. But it's, the more that we can speak about it, but also to shelve that, we don't have to shoulder the whole load. And it's definitely returning to work and being a working mum is definitely not just about the mental load.
100%. And I think, just touching on a few points that you've shared there, definitely that entry into the workforce was such a big part of it, because we didn't put aside the domestic work that we were known for. And when I say we, I'm obviously saying women of that time were responsible for a certain type of work, but that wasn't then split out equally. And so I guess what we're starting to talk about is that manifestation of the superwoman, whether it be in the workplace or whether it be at home, and the impacts of that. And in my research, I've learned that manifestation, both at home and at work, really feed off the same primary issues. So whilst we talk about work-life integration in business, in reality, this is a stretch to achieve, because most workplaces are designed to accommodate that ideal full-time employee.
And typically systems have been designed as well by men, for men.
100%.
Yeah.
Our whole infrastructure has been designed in that way. And so doing business differently and allowing part-time to be perhaps the norm or perceiving it in that way is still considered to be a temporary solution or less ideal than the full-time worker. So I'm not saying that people aren't doing this well. Some organisations are really starting to do this really, really well. But I guess it's taking time, and it can and will change over time through the right education, parent-friendly policies. You know, there's a hugely shifting legislative agenda with employment relations law. We're seeing more stories being told on LinkedIn and in the media. So the employees are demanding different. But that process of small incremental shifts is taking time. And in some ways we experienced COVID, you know, that came in and made working from home more normal. You know, if you get that drastic reason to change, it can happen quickly. But when we look at motherhood, there's not a lot of drastic reason that we are valuing. And so it's taking a really long time. And I think what I see is that the status quo is wedded to the old ways of working, and the stretch is how can we do this differently. So are you happy for me to talk a little bit more about perhaps that manifestation in the home and how that links in?
Yeah. And I think also as well, I think it's an important thing to note that during COVID, there was people talked about burnout and that because of that situation. But I've also seen some reports, particularly coming out, I think it was the Motherly Report in the US that was released a few months ago, that actually talk that burnout now is actually worse than during COVID. And so when we're talking of, you know, about working mums, is what you were saying earlier about doing it all, there is that element of, you know, of burnout. And women, it's one of the things I regularly hear about. I'm exhausted. I've got a lot going on, both at work and at home. Can I do it all? Sometimes all the plastic balls get thrown in the, like, you know, in the air, and the glass balls, I feel like, that are all dropping down. And that's also when we're sadly seeing some women leave the workplace because they're like, I can't do it all. And it's that burnout and just the pressures, feeling like you've got probably two shotguns to the head of like, oh my God, you've got to do it now, and that pressure as well.
Yeah, and part of the blessing, not blessing, we should never say COVID was a blessing, but the learnings that came out of it, some of them were blessings, which was, you know, performance and visibility are not as intimately linked as perhaps we once thought they were. But the detrimental side was definitely that people were at home and they could do these little bits of productivity at home, putting on the washing or, you know, doing the cooking or whatever it might be. And then that became the new norm. And so as people are now sort of going back to the workplace or working a hybrid arrangement, you know, they've got a lot of balls, as you say, in the air, and it's easy for one or two to slip. And I think if we just dial that back a little bit before we get to what that looks like in the workplace, a lot of this in my research has stemmed from, you know, the physiological realities that take place in the postpartum period and families needing to meet core needs and when they're in that survival mode, so perhaps due to sleep deprivation or learning this new routine, these patterns are established really early on that have this flow-on effect for months and years afterwards. And for example, you know, a core need is obviously to make sure your little one is feeding and is healthy. So this survival need will often take precedence over a career ambition or an identity that you hold in the early months. But there's an impact. So I breastfed my boys for 12 months. I had a lot of milk, and my boys therefore fed a lot. So the dependency was really on me to be within 2 hours of the house at any one moment for both of my boys, in order for them to stay healthy, but also in order for me to stay healthy. So I had mastitis 4 times across the 2 pregnancies.
Oh,
so
I had it once and that was enough.
It's pretty rotten. And so, you know, releasing milk was a thing I had to do for my own health. But that then informed the routine, of who between me and my husband, who was learning the baby's cues faster, who was settling them, who was getting up through the night, who was sleep deprived. And then that person, who in this instance was me, I was more desperate for my core needs to be met, which was for me sleep. And so I relinquished elements of my identity to survive through that period, such as the career. And consequently, I needed more recovery time, and I was less confident to come back to work sooner. Also, a lot of birthing parents are therefore with the baby more, and they transition into that mold of parenthood usually faster than the non-birthing parent, which is something that I've certainly heard a lot of stories in my research to back that. And my husband probably felt like he couldn't contribute to the feeding process until we had a bottle. So he focused on what he needed to do to enable the family, which was obviously, some of it was domestic work, but most of it was earning the money. So the research really shows that commonly parents don't revisit those parenting roles. And therefore women end up shouldering double the domestic load when compared with fathers specifically, so in heterosexual relationships, even when they work the same paid hours. So we can see how some of the really basic practice in the beginning of motherhood has this flow-on impact to work,
really
and
shapes
identity.
Who we are, the identity, and even the roles. When you go back to work and things like that, women typically going back part-time because they feel that they're the maternal element. I know my husband would be quite happy if I went full-time, and I'm like, no, part-time's fine with me. I love my day, with the boys, and that's also my shopping day that, I just like to do. And even speaking with some friends recently, they're like, no, that's my day for me. So it's interesting as well, the different roles and the hours that we choose to do, and I guess also how we redefine what is important to us in that sense. But there are impacts there, as we know that there are impacts also if you're not as visible in the workplace. How does that mean for job promotions and things like that? So yeah. But where do you think as well, where do you think Superwoman comes from? Like where can we say that this is, obviously the root cause of some of it is historical, but why is it so prevalent today and it's only getting worse rather than better?
I think it is that expectation. I think it is the gender norms, and I think it is, looking at the social norms in society. I also think that it is a product of women still not talking loudly about the issues that they're experiencing, probably, and that's not faulting women. I think it's usually because they feel abnormal or they feel unable to share that story. Back in the very early postpartum stage, your executive functioning skills are really often impacted because you're not getting any sleep. So it's very normal. And for anyone in that stage, it will come back. Sleep will come back and executive functioning will come back, but that impacts memory, it impacts communication, problem solving, decision making, like all of these really important skills. So during that phase, things can feel sluggish. They can feel hard and difficult to break through. So there's this huge identity, this period where your identity is kind of thrown up into the air, and what you knew of yourself is not what you're seeing or experiencing. It can be quite out of body for a lot of people. And obviously this is the matrescence experience that we all are starting to learn about. And so if I think about what I was throughout my 20s in my career, I was building a career. I was conforming to the corporate ideal. I went from, that HR officer through to HR director. I was very conscious of the motherhood penalty, and I knew that I wanted to achieve a certain level of seniority so that if my career stagnated, that would be okay. And I could.
Oh my goodness, I feel like I've just heard myself in my own thing. I was exactly the same.
Right? It was I'm not surprised with you, Karina, you're head of strategy. So I'm not surprised that you had a strategy there. But I think I had just seen so many women in the HR space who were returning and who were struggling, or their career, took this hit, that it was a plan for me. I had this 10-year plan. I was like, right, 5 years of it is going to be about having kids and career stagnation. Then I'll come back and then I'll progress from there. And of course, the reality is so different to that. That was the plan, which was broken as soon as I had my baby. And I had a bit of a tumultuous experience around work and giving birth that first time. And there was a whole lot of emotions that took over me in that first period of post. I'm feeling really scared, from feeling really cheated, isolated. There was a lot of grief that I experienced. And through my research, I've spoken to over 100 mothers, and I've really come to learn that my story isn't unique. So many women find that they're sort of tipped upside down personally and professionally, and it's often in unexpected ways. But the old you is clear, is confident, is building a career, and so you think that you're going to be the career mum with the baby on the hip, balancing it all. And that's that superwoman notion. It's not realistic. And we've got to bring in good enough woman. I know she doesn't sound as sexy and as appealing, but
it's reality.
And I promise she's 10 times bebetter, right?
Yeah. So you talk about needing to talk about this and to really acknowledge it. And you're not just saying it needs to be on the news or something like that. This is also at an individual level, but also acknowledging it potentially like at home with your partner or even in the workplace. So what can we do to, I guess, advocate and to change some of these conversations and those notions around, and to bring in the good enough mother approach?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, we know as career women, and we know in businesses, that we need to have some data and we need to have some science behind the storytelling. Yeah. And so I think if we're talking about how do we change the perceptions and how do we support women to return to work after parental leave so they can continue their career progress, I think we need to turn to the statistics there. So we know that 51% of the Australian workforce are female. The story there is we know 30% are in management roles, 19% in executive or senior leadership roles, and we know of those executive or senior leadership roles that only 9% are part-time, right? So we've got this pretty clear story there, and it isn't just career stagnation that occurs. There's this broader issue with access to roles. So if we partner that with the fact that family routines start really early in terms of who's looking after the children and who's doing drop-off, we're also shaping, our children are expecting certain things of the birthing parent compared to the non-birthing parent. And that comes into our ideology as well of what is good and what is the way I need to show up in these different areas. So I think, to touch on what you were alluding to there, relationships, if you're in a partnered relationship, they change dramatically in parenthood. And I think a lot of people struggle to deal with a lack of connection, or that you're transitioning into parenthood at different paces, or to find the language to share your stories with your partner. Some good advice that I received when I interviewed a perinatal psychologist as part of a program that I'll talk about as part of this conversation, but to combat some of these issues, she said she's seen it being very powerful where mothers can say to a father, I'm really depleted. I don't have a lot to give today, and I have 5 minutes for you to talk about what you need from me and how I can help, because I still love you. I don't have more to give today, but I still love you. And it was just a really powerful, I've shared that with quite a few women who have put that into action, and it's symbolized the care and the love is still there, but we're in this hard phase in life where we can't be connected as we once were. So I think that needs to be understood. Those stories need to be shared in the household. And once you feel like you're part of a team, your voice gets louder. And especially whether it is that you feel that you can advocate for other women or you can advocate in the workplace, it gets louder when you've got this stability at home.
Yeah. And we don't typically talk about, like, I often say there's so much focus when you're having a child on, right, what's the birth plan and things like that. And I often will comment going, well, birth might take, a day or 2 days, depending on how long you're in labor and what type of labor and things like that. Everyone has a different journey. But there isn't the same planning and that around how's your relationship going to go? How are you going to raise this child? What are your values? What kind of discipline may you use and things like that, until that issue may rise up. and you're confronting it generally sometimes in the heat of the moment, and then it really then is a bit like a volcano and it all erupts and comes out. But there's not that, as I said, there's so much focus on the birth with kids, but not the next 18 years on how are you going to raise a child. And that's also where probably some of that Superwoman notion comes from of, oh, well, I've seen my mum do this. She did it all. She was, maybe a stay-at-home mum. Oh, she did all these activities. Even now with school-age kids, oh, my mum was always there at the school activity, always at assembly and blah, blah, blah. Oh, I feel that I need to do that as well. And it's interesting, the different influences, but also the stories that we're being told. It's interesting. I think it's also in that pre-kids phase of that notion. Even a good friend of mine told me, Karina, don't forget your relationship before you have kids. That came first. Don't feel guilty about going on a date night and things like that. And I remember my husband and I went out for our anniversary this year for dinner. It was the first time we'd been out for dinner in probably almost 12 months. Yeah. It was amazing to reconnect and just to talk and not to be eating our meal within 5 minutes, because we then had to, look at the boys and find out what's going on. But it's these little things, I think, also that play into these notions that we've got to do it all. And also that connection from a relationship perspective as well is so important.
And letting people in as well.
Accepting help.
Accepting help. And, one of my biggest barriers when I had my kids was my little one didn't sleep more than 2 hours overnight. And it was hard. Like
that's brutal.
To this day, I still feel a bit of anxiety rising up. And, I didn't know how to express what was happening to me. I just saw this. I was in pain. I was uncomfortable. I was scared. There were so many of these emotions, and my partner could see all of these things, but perhaps, he didn't know what was the right thing to do or how to help. And it wasn't until my mum saw me, sort of break into tears, which wasn't common for me over dinner, break into tears. And she said, "What's happening?" And I was like, I haven't had sleep. I can't sleep. And I was in that hyper aroused mode, that so many women experience in early motherhood, which is an evolutionary protective mechanism to keep your baby and you safe. So it's there for a reason. But it was preventing me from sleeping. And she said to me, "Right, tomorrow morning, I want you here first thing. You're going to sleep for the whole day, and you're going to wake up to breastfeed, and we're going to look after Hamish. And I'm not going to have that's what you're doing." And I did that for 3 weeks. And it was enough to get enough sleep that I could start to think my way through the problem. And that was a real shift. So I think we're not good at sharing our story. We're not good at necessarily calling in the cavalry when we need them. And I'll just add to that story. I'm obviously very open about my pelvic floor experiences. 1 in 3 women, for anyone who's in this context, experience incontinence following birth. I had a hypertonic pelvic floor that went undiagnosed. I didn't have language around it. I found that I would go for long walks, and I would, unfortunately, wasn't just when I sneezed that I weed. I would honestly I had big trouble there. And I stayed quiet through until my second child was born, and I was in that postpartum stage. I then heard a podcast where they basically said, it's not normal and it won't fix itself. And that's when I went and started getting help and getting treatment. And over 5 years, I did all of the work to try to strengthen my pelvic floor. It didn't get better. And so last year I had surgery where they literally lifted up, cut one of the ligaments and lifted the whole prolapse up, and they put in a mesh sling. And the surgeon said to me, "You are one of the youngest patients I've ever worked on. Usually I'm working on 70-year-old women who, in hushed whispers, have been talking about incontinence their whole life. They've experienced it. We need to share these stories, because I didn't know that it wasn't normal, and I was going to be that 70-year-old who stopped running and stopped doing the things that I loved in life because I gave birth to children." So that's where the storytelling becomes really powerful and really important.
Yeah. And I thought, geez, that story also gave me a bit of chills as well, of just how profound it is. And I think it's such a good reminder that we do. And it's so much of a thing of Western culture, I think, as well, that we've got to sweep it under the carpet. Everything's okay. I put on, say, my makeup mask and go off for work and everything's fine. But it's okay to not be okay, but also to share those stories and actually do it. I was telling I won't share it too much, but I was telling a story of some girlfriends last week, and I was like, is this normal? And they're like, no, Karina. I'm going, okay, I better do something about that. But it's funny how, that's things that what you think, well, it's just happening to me. Is it going to be okay? Isn't. And that it's just that also we're wanting to be resilient. We're wanting to just get up and just get on with things. And so we're like, oh, look, we don't want to complain. We don't want to cause attention to ourselves. And I think even from a workplace perspective, we're like, and I know the notion of, I'm just grateful I've got a job after kids. So I'm just going to accept whatever I'm given. I'm very grateful to have part-time hours. I'm grateful to have a job rather than being made redundant, which we know happens all too often. And so you're like, right, I'm just going to try and do it all. But that's also what causes the breaking points. And so many women, as what we've talked about previously, return back into work and they feel like they can't do it because it just all gets too much when they don't actually need to. Of also asking for help is so important.
Absolutely. And I think, there's a couple of things that you've just alluded to there, which are really, really important. There are a lot of babies born into Australia every year. I think that we've dropped from 30,000 annually, or it's more than that. I can't remember what it is, Karina. You'll be able to tell me. You're the facts girl. Is it?
Oh, it's like 250 or something. Yeah, it's 300,000. There's some high number.
It's a high number, and I think it's dropped. So I actually think it's around 280 at the moment. But you think, well, everybody has babies. I'm not unique. This must be normal. Or I'm just going to stay quiet because I'm really scared and I've just got to cope. And that's not true. We used to have villages. We used to learn from mums and aunties and grandparents and have these support mechanisms. We're not drawing on those things anymore. And another thing that you talked about, which is relating back to the workplace, we need to think about the difference between equality and equity in motherhood and the impact on work. So we can provide practices at work which encourage equality, such as merit-based recruitment or equal consideration into roles, equal policy terms. But we also need to realise the equity piece, that there are innate barriers in the way that work has been designed, and within a large majority of family setups, which, the expectations, the gendered expectations often prevent mothers from being able to step into senior roles. Another example is, whilst we've had incredible leaders like Renee Brown that educate everybody on what leadership should look like and the importance of what used to be called soft skills. We're now going to call those the hard skills in the workplace. Things like being able to communicate and empathise and be vulnerable, all of those things. We still have many traditional leadership expectations that reflect a male and that ideal full-time employee. So people and culture teams and leaders have a really big job to change that issue. Can I share a really quick story on this just to put it into context?
Yeah, definitely.
One of my clients asked me to put together a suite of parent-friendly policies, and I presented that to the board, and the board didn't approve them. So they felt that they were too generous. So I went away and reworked those policies, and I came back to the board 3 months later. And in that time, the chair of the board had become a grandfather, and he commented that the new policies weren't generous enough. And so we reverted back to the original policy suite. So he had witnessed his daughter's experience with motherhood, and his perspective had completely changed. So our barriers to doing this differently reside within our perspective of what's valued.
And I think also, just to that point, it's really interesting that to make this change, it isn't just about the females and the women in the organisation or even at home advocating for this. As you said, 51% or 50% of, our society is also male. So we also need males to come along for the ride and also support us in that. So it's great that, say a grandfather is then advocating for women in that, because he's seeing firsthand with the daughters and the impacts that they're having. And it's typically not until someone has experienced it or seen it firsthand will they actually understand the impacts and being able to support it and things like that. So even just personally last night, my husband was talking to his brother about childcare subsidies and things like that. Obviously, I'm across different elements, and it was amazing how much he was then articulating a lot of what I knew back into his brother. So it was a male to male discussion. And he's like, no, this is what it costs and this is what you got to do. And I'm like, oh, he has been listening through all of my ranting and raving about this. But it's one of those things as well about we need men to also advocate for this policy change, men to be those allies in the way that we do it. I was at a conference 12 months ago speaking to a room of probably 90% men, very much around how do we get more, women into the workplace and female leaders. But then also I put it back to them. I said, what are you doing to support the females in your team? What are you doing to support the women in your lives? And I said, like, my husband's got a senior role. He still does drop off pickups and things like that at childcare and also school. And this guy came up to me the next day and said, I went home and had a conversation with my wife and actually said, I want to be there more present. I want to be more of a role model of dropping off and picking up and having that flexibility. And he said, thank you. And it was interesting that just by one conversation and just trying to change it around, I didn't want to say, men, you need to do this, this, and this, but getting them to think about how they can support was actually quite profound. So yeah, I think it's changing the language between males and females, but definitely to your point, from a grandfather's perspective, those people are ones that we need to, so we don't have to change, so we can remove that perfect mother notion and the superwoman, because it's then socially accepted for men also to carry the responsibilities as well.
Yeah, and what you've just pointed out there is how brilliantly you have been, sharing stories with your partner so that he has the language and the understanding to be able to do that. And there are things, I sometimes think that my husband is more maternal than I am.
Yeah.
He's amazing with the kids. He just seems to get it. But when it came to, who was going to take leave and how that was going to work, I still come back to there is this physiological reality, this biological reality that ties that birthing parent to the children. And it's in that period that we seem to be creating, the waves that then impact the way she returns to the workplace. And just whilst we're on perceptions, the primary carers, this perception that we're having time out of the workforce, which is leisure time.
It's the hardest job going around.
Oh, and maybe it's not, I shouldn't even say that. We've probably moved on a little bit from there, but this idea that we're not progressing, that this is time off, it's unproductive, or it's a stagnation of career, and we know why that perception is there. It's because work is held in such high esteem within our society. But once again, it feeds into the same challenging perception that to be part-time or to be a primary carer is to be deficit to an ideal full-time employees. And as women, we internalize that voice as well. The number of people who say, oh, I only work X number of days, there's an apology that comes in their voice. And I think we've learned a lot through neuro more recently, where they've talked about sort of the skill development that takes place in pregnancy and early motherhood, which is really remarkable. So in my research, I stumbled across Dr. Sarah Mackay. So she's a motherhood neuroscientist and she has a PhD from Oxford University. And I interviewed Sarah as part of the FOUND program, which is a digital education program I've developed to combat all of the issues that we're talking about. And Sarah advised that in pregnancy, a mother's brain reorganises and enables her to operate in a more streamlined way. So instead of this being a period of deficit, it's actually this incredibly powerful evolutionary neurological nudge to support a period of rapid growth required to learn motherhood. And the result of that is that mothers become more attuned to social cues. They need to, the baby's crying. What does it need? And what that leads to is a better understanding of people, their beliefs, their perspectives. And a lot of the women that I've spoken to in my research refer to this as a new lens on life, from me to we. So I think when we look at sort of the blueprint for future skills at work, many of them point towards human-centered leadership skills as absolutely essential, and especially as AI becomes more and more present. It's the empathy, the listening, the communication, patience, resilience, compassion. And RMIT Forward and Sally McNamara specifically has done some incredible work in this space where they've provided language around the skills that mothers develop and how that applies to the workplace. So I think these skills partnered with some of the realities of motherhood, which you're tremendous at talking about, being time poor, the mental load, multitasking, efficiency, prioritization. There's a really powerful skill set there that we need to start recognizing in business, and we need to start using as part of our language as mothers.
I think it's so important. And I think also not just from a workplace perspective of recognizing those skills and, put motherhood on the resume. I've got it on my LinkedIn profile of, yep, I'm a mum and I'm not going to be ashamed about it. But then also when you're returning back into work, you typically, and also the research shows this, your confidence is probably going to be at one of its lowest points throughout your entire career. Because probably some of the things that have actually come out of saying, yes, you're on leisure, you've had this 12 months off, you feel like you've got baby brain, which I think it's actually come out to say there's no such thing as baby brain.
Yeah,
and has actually been debunked.
Yeah.
And so you feel like you're coming in going, you've gone through matrescence, you've got this new identity, this new person to come back, and your confidence generally, I know I experienced this, is going, who am I? Can I even remember how to do an email and the like? And so you're really low. But I think also by articulating and also giving women that validation, hey, you've got all these amazing skills that not only you've had this career beforehand, you've been raising this little human. Your social cues, your emotional intelligence, no doubt, has just gone up, tenfold. And also celebrating and recognizing that, because not a lot is actually done. I know you come back to work and it's like, okay, it's like you've been on holidays for 2 weeks and you're expected to be the same person and just pick up where you left off almost. But I think also getting, particularly from a manager's perspective, acknowledging that transition, acknowledging the change they've been through, and also acknowledging the new skills and really wanting to tailor that back into people. I'm saying, you're amazing. Kudos to you. You almost need this recognition and certificate almost of prior learning of, into motherhood, because, of really debunking some of those things of it's not leisure time. You've really been studying hard.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. It's all the big emotions that come with motherhood, which is underconfidence, it's being scared, it's the identity grief, it's all the things that you've just talked about, which impacts then the confidence and the clarity upon return. And then we've talked about the executive functioning skills, which perhaps are problematic for a period of time until you get sleep or until your mental load is shared or becomes less, and then it all comes back. It's completely reasonable that if you have a lot on your plate, more than previously, that you might drop a plate or two. So that's not a neurological deficit. That's just a reality that you've got too much on your plate. And perhaps something that we haven't really touched on is, in Australia, employee wellbeing is really being prioritised at a legislative level, a policy level, an employment brand level. So employers need to care more about the health and the wellbeing of their employees in order to stay relevant and to be able to compete for talent. So it's okay to break away from the mold of silence and start leaning into sharing your individual story and your wellbeing needs and communicating some of those things to your employer. Otherwise, they may just expect that previous, woman to come back, and you've changed. And we need to enable more realistic participation through that storytelling if we're going to cancel Superwoman, which probably comes to, I know we were talking about how we actually break free from the Superwoman cycle. What do we do there? Look, I think this is all about enabling women to prevent the typical symptoms that we hear about on LinkedIn, the mental load, the motherhood penalty, the parental wall, and burnout from occurring, and providing some sort of early intervention or management strategy if they are occurring. So I think there's a range of strategies employers can really help with. But there's also things that mothers and families can do first to combat the issues. So I'm a big believer that this might sound a bit pessimistic, it's not what I mean, but we don't rise to the level of our expectation. We really fall to the level of our training.
Yeah, that'd be true. Yeah.
And over the last 5 years, I've developed a digital education program, as I said previously, and a coaching program to help mothers feel found in motherhood. And it's called the Found program. And it's been designed in conjunction with clinical professionals and over 100 mothers. And it's divided into 3 stages. And I'll reference this because I think it points to some of the things that we're perhaps not doing at the moment. So stage 1 normalizes matrescence. So this scientific term which we use to describe the transition from woman to mother, gives her language, helps her unpick her physical, emotional, social, cultural, and relationship changes. And it sets up this new solid foundation of understanding to enable her to start thinking about what her future freedom needs to look like. Stage 2 is all around redefining and re-emerging. So let's start looking at the limiting stories and beliefs. Yeah. Let's redefine her values, her priorities, her boundaries, and start thinking about how we create personal power and a pathway back into the career that she strives for, or the life that she's looking to have. And stage 3 is about refining her career aspirations, thinking about the employer perspective, because that's really important to the success of a returning mother as well, and then enabling her to step into that return to work conversation with some confidence. And I've mentioned this off when we weren't recording, that I really developed this program for me. You know, this was a bit of a selfish pursuit. I needed something and I couldn't find what I needed out there. And so we currently have a waitlist open for stage 1 of this program, and it will be launching on the 1st of October this year. So if anyone's listening and they're needing that support or they're interested, go along to www.thefoundprogram.com and learn more on Instagram. I'm at found_learning_motherhood. And the last thing I'll just say on that is this is the time when we start thinking about, instead of gifting onesies, we move across to starting to gift her some agency and some personal power, because generally mum will do the rest if she's given those things.
Yeah, exactly. Can't wait to see that program launched. So just on that, of like some tips and things like that, just to finish up on. So what are some tips that you'd like to give and advice for, you know, women that are maybe feeling that they can identify that they do fit the mold and the notion of a superwoman? To what are some things that they could start to try and take action on I guess it's unpicking. It's going to be a bit like a woolen jumper. It's not going to be undone straight away, but it's going to take quite a while to unpick some of these notions and that. I know some of this as well will start from a mental perspective, very internal, of rewriting what we see as cultural norms and rewriting your own destiny. But what are some tips that people can start to take action on?
Look, I think you've touched on a really important one. It is allowing some time. I didn't realise what I needed until I'd birthed my second child. And that's when I realised so much had changed. I had been holding on to my former identity and just waiting for her to return. And then I reached this point where, you know, I realised that wasn't a possibility and I had to push forward. And I think at that point, it's about understanding that if you invest, if you want to become a leader, you go on leadership training, right? You need to invest in your growth. If you're finding this hard, you are normal. This is really, really hard. And it's okay to say, I need to invest in me as part of this process. I think for too long we've labelled motherhood as innate and just part of what it is, you know, in being a woman, if you choose to have children. And we're starting to learn that's not really the case. There is a big learning curve in motherhood. And part of that learning, it's not just learning how to swaddle and how to put your baby to sleep, although those things are important, or how to breastfeed. It's actually learning who you are as a person, what you want to prioritise. If your time has been reduced, where are you going to spend it? And what's going to fill your cup? And what's important? And what's your reality as well? You know, I think there's been a lot of hype around gender equality and talking about sort of 50-50 splits. That's not reality for a lot of people, you know. And I think you've allowing women to understand what's happened to them and allowing education around the family situation so that couples can feel united in what we are as a family and what we need to do to get through this challenging learning growth period, which can I say is filled with a lot of cuddles and beautiful things as well. We're sort of talking about all the negatives, but it is about having an investment in mum's growth and in her confidence. I think the other big thing there is a lot of the women, or at least the women in our research, has shown that your manager is one of the most important relationships that you can have whilst you're not in paid work. If you're the primary carer, that's the person who's going to advocate for you when you're not in the room, and you need that person to be on your team. So
and they can be a make or break person. I had a manager once who wasn't on my team, and I was very lucky. I had a good friend of mine in employment law, and I had some friends in HR that were backing me. Otherwise, I probably would have been lost, and I would have, if I didn't have my cohort around me, because my manager wasn't supporting me. And I cannot stress the importance of that.
It's so important. And the other one, which I get contacted honestly weekly from different people, putting forward an issue they've got where they don't understand their entitlements. And so, I think employers have they need to start front footing discussions around entitlements, flexibility options, acknowledging that a lot of employers take this approach of, what do you need? We'll make it work, and they're the ones who are doing it well. I'd actually say that's not good enough. I think they need to come forward with, this is what you are entitled to by law. This is what we do as a business. And this is why, it links into our culture in this way. It leads into our strategy in this way. And now I want to talk about, you tell me what's going on in your circumstances so we can find a solution. It's a symbol of, we care, we want you back. We're going to front foot this and support you. And that means the world to somebody who's feeling underconfident and unsure. And it's going to encourage her to share more stories. The other things that I really urge for businesses in particular, if there's anyone who's listening from a business perspective, know your data, really understand when she typically exits work, when she returns, what capacity, when does she opt out completely, how many carers days is she actually taking versus what the perceived cost is to the business. If we can't find a way to make work and family less at odds, we won't be able to tap into this incredible talent market that is available out there, and that Superwoman expectation will continue.
Yeah, really, it's a two-prong approach, probably even a three-prong approach of the individual, your partner, and your village around you, but then also the organization coming in around to provide that. And really, that Superwoman notion sits with us, I guess, typically as an individual of what we think, but then also having the support both at home and in the workplace can also help to unravel that and also rewrite the story and the notion. And look, everyone is going to have a different sphere of influence, a different experience. But when you actually say, I don't need to do it all, I don't need to be this super mum, good enough is, okay. If they've only had scrambled eggs for dinner, that's okay. You know what? Like, they're alive. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, really, what do they need at that particular moment, I think is so true from a mother's perspective. And we put so much pressure on ourselves unwillingly, I think, at times, and we've all been there. And I would say as well, if you start to go through the journey, I don't actually think there's ever an end point. I know that this year school has been a whole new just learning again of everything. I thought I had it all set up, and then I've got 2 drop-off pickups between my husband and I. We often go, right, you do one, you do the other, or
what we do too.
And then even just the school things, like, so I thought I had everything sorted, and then school is a whole other ball game, probably even worse. So it's all the different stages, which, sorry if you're listening and you've just had a baby, I won't say it's going to necessarily get easier. It's just, probably your confidence in your muscle for being able to navigate this gets a little bit easier, but I will say there's still going to be bumps in the road. But having your toolbox and your support around you, both from a family as well as a workplace perspective, can also be really powerful.
What you've said is exactly right. We've got children who are the same age, and so we're both in the same situation. Yes. But something I always say to women is it's not about who's going to pick up your child from childcare when they're sick the first and the second time. It's the 8th, 9th and 10th time when you're already feeling terrible about needing to step away from work. Who's going to pick up Bubba at that moment? That's really, really important. So I completely agree with you, Karina. And this is where, once again, if I was to try to campaign to some business out there to care more about what we're talking about, if you want to future-proof your workplace and you want to see career progression and get that 19% of executives who are female at a higher percentage, you need to start looking at your workplace design. You need to start chunking down work. It's not about doing less. It's about doing the same differently and thinking of it in terms of that lens. And that's certainly the work that I do through the People Paradox, my HR arm of the business. So if there's anyone listening who wants to know more about that, just email me, renee@thepeopleparadox.com.
Fantastic. Well, I know that we could actually talk all day on these topics, and we haven't even really got into the deep dive of matrescence and everything else like that. So I'm sure as you're listening, you can probably tell Renee and I are two very passionate people around this. As I said in the outset, look, we are really committed to supporting women, particularly around that return to work, but also helping you feel confident navigating motherhood and also a career. We're not saying that you have to do one or the other. Everyone has their own journey, but we both of us really want to support women in that sense of being able to combine it both and provide you the tools and tips and out there. So thank you so much, Renee, for this amazing chat. I know we've had to delay it a few times just with our competing schedules, but I have to say it's exactly what I hoped for. So thank you so much.
Oh, Karina, thanks for the invitation. I'm so glad we got there as well. And, it'll be, I'm sure, the first of many collaborations between us. So thank you for all the work that you do.
My pleasure. And have a great day. Thank you for listening to the Working Mama podcast. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast catcher. Please also feel free to contact me on any of the Working Mama social channels. Remember, Mama is MUMMA, or website www.workingmama.com.au. I would appreciate you to share this podcast with friends and colleagues, especially those that are parents managing the juggle. And I would really appreciate if you had to take the time out to leave a review of the podcast. Thank you and see you next time. Have a great week.